now being recorded. If you prefer to ask your questions anonymously, there is an option to do so in the Q&A. And there will be polling questions during this presentation. And in order to get CPE credits, please answer the polling questions. Whether or not you answer them perfectly does not affect your credits. If for any reason you cannot answer the polling question, please type your name in the chat function and let us know. And then finally, for the survey, there will be a link posted. We'll make an announcement at the end of class. There will be a link posted in the chat to click on and to complete the survey for this class. And it's the same link for all classes. So there's a drop-down menu to pick which class you're filling out CP or filling out the survey for. And those CP certificates will be emailed to you by the end of next week. So I think that's it in terms of housekeeping items. And now I'm going to turn it over to Amy Meyer, who's going to present GASB 87 leases today.
All right, great. Thank you, Whitney. I'll share my screen and we will start the presentation. Second here. All right. Just want to make sure you can see the slides and not my notes. Is that
yes.
Correct? Okay, perfect. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Good morning. And I'm glad you all made it back from the other class and are still awake and ready to go. And we're going to talk about 87. And I know a lot of you have heard it over and over and too many times, but this class, we're going to go over a lot of the background on 87 and the accounting and disclosure requirements as we've done before. A lot of it is the same things that you've heard before, but hopefully each time you attend these classes, you'll catch up on one more nuance to the statement, and hopefully we can answer questions along the way. And any questions that we can't answer, me or Whitney can't answer during the class, we will be sure and follow up afterward just to make sure, because there's so many different components to it and Q&A that GASB has issued, and so we want to make sure that we don't answer incorrectly. But hopefully you'll ask the types of questions that are the more common types. And then we're also going to talk about some audit considerations, just to give you a heads up on what to expect during the audit. And so for those of you that don't know me, here's a very old picture of me because I hate having my picture taken. I'm not going to update it for a while. I've been with the firm. I'm one of the audit partners, and I've been with the firm for over 28 years now, and I specialize in municipal audit. And there's my contact information if you have any questions. All right, so we're going to cover a lot this morning. We have until 11:15, and hopefully, as I normally do, I'll talk fast, but again, any questions along the way are fine. And I've got a few flexible items that, there's a lot of slides, as someone pointed out, 87 slides. Yes, Teresa, 87 slides for 87. I never even noticed that. It's really, truly a coincidence, which is kind of funny. There are a few slides that we're going to kind of breeze over, because some of them I gave to you just to have that resource to look for you to go through as you're prepping for the statement. All right. So these are the topics we're going to cover today. Again, background, audit approach, and some example disclosure revisions. I'm hoping we do have time to get to that one. All right. So first, leases and associated guidance. So I know I'm going to sound like a broken record for some of this. You're going to be tired of hearing about the topic, but we want to keep going through it a little bit. So it was issued in June of 2017. Implementation year is here. As many of you know, implementation was delayed with GASB 95 due to COVID-19. So this is the year. You can't avoid it anymore. June 30, 22 and December 31, 22. And then also applicable this year is Implementation Guide 2019-3, which is specific to leases. If you noticed, if you were in Whitney's class, the implementation guides sometimes cover a number of different topics. This implementation guide was specific to leases, includes 77, I guess they're not new anymore, 77 questions and answers. And the objective of implementation guides is to provide guidance that clarifies or explains or elaborates on GASB statements in a question and answer format. So it really is easy to understand. It's organized by topic. And so it's an important tool and source of information that'll help you during the implementation and decision points. And so you really want to, when GASB issues these implementation guides, you really do want to review them just to become familiar with the questions that are in there in case not that you have to read the whole thing from front to back, but look at the topics, look at a few different questions and answers to see if you run into a question, or excuse me, an event or a situation along the way that you think, hey, that question or that answer might be in the implementation guide to help me, because the GASB statement may not deal with it directly. And so, and a few years ago, GASB changed how the implementation guides function. They are now authoritative. In the past, they were guidance, but not authoritative. They are now just as authoritative, or I should say just right below the statements, and they're authoritative. All right. So other implementation guides that include questions related to leases include 2020-1, 21-1. They include questions. And then earlier, although these, you see the implementation dates here are fiscal 23 or calendar 22 and 23, depending on which one it is. The GASB encourages you to early implement these Q&A when you have a with the pronouncement for those questions. You don't have to implement the entire implementation guide, but the sections related to leases can be early implemented in the year. So you want to take that into consideration. As Whitney, if you were in Whitney's class for the GASB update earlier, GASB 99 was issued in April of 22 and does contain a component of paragraphs related to leases. There are 5 components to it: lease term, short-term leases, lessee, lessor considerations, and lease incentives. Although you see the implementation dates for this is June 30, 23 and calendar 23. I'm not going to go into the details of the statement, but I just wanted, as we talked about this morning, you want to consider early implementing the leases provisions of Statement 99 at the same time you implement 87. Again, not a requirement, but just something to consider if you have any leases that are subject to the provisions in a statement, because GASB does allow implementation of components of Statement 99. You can implement just the leases components. You don't need to early implement the entire statement, since it has a number of different topics. It has 11 different topics in 10 other topics in addition to leases. Hopefully that makes sense.
And Amy, there is a question already.
Sure.
Okay, so the question is, the lease for commercial property commenced on 1/1/2020. Can the lease asset/liability be determined and measured starting on 7/1/2021 in the first year of implementation?
Yes, the easy answer to that is yes. And we'll cover that when we get to the lease term, when we talk about different components of the lease term. But yes, it doesn't matter in this year of implementation. It doesn't matter when the lease, in the past, when the lease was implemented. The first year of the lease term this year of implementation is the beginning of your fiscal year, whether it be a calendar year, so January 1, or fiscal year, so July 1, 21. Yes.
And that's it.
Okay, great. So something else I want to alert you to, in case you don't know about it, the California Committee on Municipal Accounting periodically issues white papers and government industry alerts on topics. The white papers are specific to are California specific topics, and you've seen those, for example, related to redevelopment agency, pension considerations, and those are some of the white papers that have been issued in the past. But then the group also issues industry alerts periodically, and so the industry alert originally was issued in February 22. It was reissued in April of 22 to correct an error in the journal entry labeling. The bulk of the statement, or the industry alert, or GIA, did not change, just the journal entry titling was corrected to clarify something. So the links to the site, you'll see these industry alerts and the white papers. You'll see communication of that, of course, from us as an audit firm. We usually let our clients know that they've been issued, but you also see them on League of California Cities and CSMFO's Professional Standards Committee has been sending out the alerts when these are issued as well, and including the link. You can find the link on CalCPA's website. And also I have the link at the end of this presentation as well, so that you can see all of the white papers and industry alerts that have been issued in the past. But it's a really good source of information, and we're going to go over, we'll go over some of the provisions in it in a few slides. So why do we care about 87? Why are we here today? So the previous guidance related to leases versus GASB 87. So I'm calling it the not so new guidance for 87. You know, it's been around for quite a few years now with the delay of the implementation. It's not new. You've been through these classes, you've learned about it. And so this is just that final refresher of, hey, the year is here, it's time, it's no longer in the future, and we need to take care of it now. So under the previous guidance, leases were split into capital leases versus operating leases based on a 4-part test. And then most lease transactions were reported differently than similar non-lease transactions. With the new guidance, it specifies the, what a lease is and what qualifies under a lease. The overall determination is going to depend on the lease contract and whether it conveys the control of the right to use the underlying asset. It's all about that control. And then of course the term, which we'll get to on the next slide, that tells you whether the asset is subject to 87. So with control, it's the right to obtain the present service capacity from the use of the underlying asset as specified in the contract, and the right to determine the nature and manner and use of the underlying asset. And when we say contract, it's the normal business law rules. A contract, it written, verbal, but if it serves as a contract, not that governments normally have verbal contracts, but that's, it's the normal definition of a contract. It's the contract that conveys the control. And so it's non-financial assets. So, and wow, all of a sudden I can't speak all of a sudden, sorry. And also the lease has to be non-cancelable. Those are the things. So a contract to convey the control and non-cancelable. So that term and period is what makes an agreement subject to the provisions of 87, and it's related to non-financial assets. So non-financial assets include items such as land, buildings, and equipment. And it's not, as we'll go over in a few slides, it's not a contract to purchase. It does not change the finance purchase guidance that you've been used to over the, what would have previously been called a capital lease, where you've recorded it as long-term debt, recorded the capital asset. It doesn't change the accounting for those. If you know you're going to purchase it, then you still account for it in that manner. But it's just called a lease now. No longer have that distinction between capital and operating lease. So one thing that you want to think about is building leases may also be subject. Your building leases, things that you're using the right to use the asset, but it doesn't include any maintenance costs that are included in the contract. It's just that amount that's I don't want to call it purchase, the cost of the right to use of it. So exclusions to statement 87, items that are not included under the provisions of the statement include intangible assets, biological assets, inventory, contracts that are considered service concession arrangements, supply contracts such as agreement to purchase power, leases for underlying assets that are financed with proceeds of outstanding conduit debt, and the underlying asset that are both reported by the lessor and the short-term lease. Those are generally 12 months or less. So anything 12 months or less, short-term lease, not subject to 87. That's kind of the easiest first test that you can do, is when something is 12 months or less. And when we talk about the lease term, which we're going to go on the next slide, it includes any extension period if you know you're going to extend the lease.
Okay, and we have one question.
Sure.
May I ask, non-cancelable lease apply to after the term is up or within the term, such as a 5 years term? So if a non-cancelable lease applies to after the term is up or within the term, like a 5-year term?
To determine the term, it's the non-cancelable period. So if you have the ability to cancel within the 5-year period of the term, let's go on to the next slide, because that's where we're going to talk about it. It includes the period that's non-cancelable, plus any periods with the options to extend, option to terminate, whether the lessee or the lessor have the option to extend or terminate. Now, how you determine whether they're included in the lease term is you have to make a decision at that time, are you reasonably certain the event will occur? Not reasonably certain, you're not quite sure if you're going to extend it, then you'd exclude that optional period. If you are pretty sure at that time that you are going to extend the lease, you intend to extend the lease, and say it's a long-term lease and you've always extended the, always exercise the option for extending, then, and you're going to continue to do that, then you would include that optional period. So I hope that answers it. It's that you have to make decisions, and you make in the future, if you change your mind, that's okay. That's when you relook at it and you may remeasure, or there may be a termination event that stops the recording of the lease at that time, but it's at the time of accounting. So in this year of implementation, July 1, or it's always the July 1 or whenever the lease was started. You may have a lease that was executed during fiscal 22. At that beginning point, you have to have those decision points. What's your intent at that moment when you're reasonably certain?
Yes, and then there's one other question. So if a lease is year to year, so say 12 months, but it is likely to be renewed year over year, it should count for GASB 87 question.
Agreed. Again, reasonably certain is the key that statement 87 keys in on. If you're reasonably certain you're going to continue, and that's going to make it a long-term lease. You're certain you're going to make it more than 12 months, then you would include that. Yes.
So then there's a further piece to this question. So in this particular case, the term is infinite. So I'm guessing that they assume that the lease term is going to be forever.
Wow.
Well, it's going to just continue forever. So what is the term then?
That's a darn good question, and I don't know the answer off the top of my head.
So this one has to do with copiers.
Yeah. Oh, goodness, copier.
Ugh.
Yes. So that's where you want to look at your calculation, and if it did go on for infinity, I mean, maybe use $9.99 to do your calculation. What would be the dollar amount discounted, and then look at your materiality come into play. Now, normally when we get into the calculation of the lease asset or lease liability, when you're setting that materiality threshold, you want to set a policy as to whether that determination of the materiality or what's going to be capitalized, is it at the gross amount or the discounted amount, whether you're going to, and then stick with that policy. But that's going to be the start to kind of deciding whether something's material. If it goes on for infinity, that is a darn good question, and I will find that answer.
I would think that if it were at least for copiers, that maybe something that would play into that decision is whether or not you plan to use copiers in 20 years or 30 years.
Good question.
If you're moving more towards paperless, it's a possibility it might not.
Good point. Yes.
So you have to think about reasonably certain future. And
Very
then
good.
Wouldn't it depend on the life of the asset?
Yes, that's a good point too. The life of the asset. That's a really good point, because even if the lease is, that asset is only going to have a useful life for so much time, how many times is the maintenance man there to fix the leases, the copiers? Yes, it's something to look at.
Yeah. And that's it.
All right, great. So the lease term, the period for which both the lessee and the lessor have an option to terminate the lease term without the permission of the other party, or if both parties have agreed to extend, have to agree to extend, those are cancelable periods and are excluded from the lease term. For example, like if there is a rolling month-to-month lease, which I still don't think is what we were just talking about a minute ago, but maybe that is where the answer is. If it's a rolling month-to-month lease, or a lease that continues into a holdover period until a new lease contract is signed, it would not be considered enforceable if both the lessee and the lessor have an option to terminate it. Therefore, either can cancel the lease at any time, and so that makes it cancelable, not included in part of the lease term. If a fiscal funding, so there's the component of fiscal funding clauses that are sometimes put into agreements. If that fiscal funding or cancellation clause allows a governmental lessee to cancel a lease, typically on an annual basis with the budget, if the government does not appropriate funds for the lease payments, this type of clause should affect the lease term only if it's reasonably certain that the clause will be exercised. So normally those are put in there as a backstop in case there's not funding available. And so if it's just that backstop and you anticipate that there's not going to be a budget problem, you're not going to exercise that clause, then you would not, you would not consider that. You would exclude that clause when you're including a lease term.
Okay, so there's 4 more questions.
4. Okay.
The lease term. So the first one is, does it matter who has the right to renew? For example, if only the lessee has the right to renew and I am the lessor, can I say I am certain the lessee will renew, so I include the extension period in the lease term?
You can't answer for the other entity. So you're making the decisions for yourself and whether, and I got mixed up on whether you're the lessor or the lessee. So for your components of the contract, you're answering those questions. Unless you have some sort of, I think you said lessee, if the lessee has, sent a letter of intent to extend or something when you're doing at the period of determination, that might be something that you could consider, because now they've told you that we intend to, but you can't make decisions on their behalf without their input.
Okay, and then there's a copier has a useful life. I would think the life of the asset would apply. So I think we did kind of answer this in that it should be considered in determining the amount of time, the lease term time.
Agreed.
What if the contract has successive 25-year renewal options for a total of 50 years? Is it acceptable to say it is reasonably certain to include the 50 years in the lease term?
Yes, if you are reasonably certain you're going to, and I know it's hard to think that far ahead, but yes, if you're reasonably certain that you're going to extend them at that point, then it is okay to include it, but you want to make sure you're doing that documentation of your decision point in your records, because then as it gets closer to that option period, it's okay to look at it and see, are we going to extend, and making that assessment at that point in the future.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just jumping to the next. Does materiality take into consideration to determine if a lease applies to GASB 87? Example, the lease with a $1 a year amount with a term of 5 years. Yeah, materiality would definitely apply. Sorry, something's frozen on here.